Hello and welcome back to the book log. Today I'm logging my Year of Rest and Relaxation by Ottessa Moshfegh. It's a little bit difficult to review this book because it doesn't have a lot of plot and it doesn't have a lot of things happening. Its primary focus is much more on atmosphere and mood and vibe, if you will. And I think it does an excellent job of creating those things. It's languid, dreary, hazy. It's like sleepwalking through some strange dream. Also, this is one of the books where I am going to warn about spoilers. I'm going to spoil this book. I don't always mention this. Maybe I should, but there are some elements in this book that I would consider to be spoilers. So I'll just say that before you continue. The narrator is never named, but she's described as this beautiful, thin, blonde, waspy, rich Columbia graduate living on the Upper East Side in Manhattan. Both of her parents died when she was in high school, and she is subsisting off of rent payments from tenants living in her childhood home, as well as unemployment checks since she was recently fired from her job at an art museum. She's clearly very depressed, detached, disinterested, and disengaged from the world, and her plan to remedy this is to try to sleep as much as she possibly can within one calendar year of her life by taking a variety of combinations of different pharmaceuticals, some real, some fictional, in the hopes that she'll come out the other side refreshed and renewed somehow. Your body constantly regenerates, so maybe your soul does too. The book is more or less just following her around as she attempts this feat. It's tricky to explain all that without making it sound boring, so I think an important thing to mention about this book, one of the reasons that I think it works so well, is that it's also really, really funny. Not in the sense that I would call it a comedy or anything like that, but it's funny in a grim sort of way, and I did find myself laughing several times reading it. For one, the narrative voice is just incredibly sarcastic and deadpan and witty and cynical, and it's just played off in constant contrast with the sheer absurdity of the things the narrator is doing. She mostly just sits in her apartment and watches the same VCRs over and over again, consuming nothing but junk food and coffee from the bodega down the street, drifting in and out of multi-day drug-induced blackouts. And I guess it's just funny in its sheer irrationality. This plan of hers to find peace is so extreme and unhealthy, and it makes such little sense, but this is what she's decided to do, and she's committed to it. There are very few other characters in this book, but the ones that are present are these perfectly crafted caricatures of some of the more unpleasant New York stereotypes. On the more minor side, you have Trevor, the narrator's on-again, off-again boyfriend guy who's a lot older than her and is more or less your standard douchey Wall Street sociopath. And Pink Shi, who is this pretentious art scene guy who makes bizarre art installations that the narrator hates, things like taxidermy dogs and art made from his own cum. Both of those characters really only factor in through the narrator's memories of the past, although Pink Shi makes an appearance towards the end of the book as well when the narrator needs someone to check in on her and bring her supplies while she attempts to black out for 4 months straight on Infirmiderol, which is one of the fictional drugs the narrator frequently takes, which causes her to black out for precisely 3 days at a time. She's not sleeping. In fact, she gets up to a whole variety of activities while under the influence. She just can't remember them when she wakes up. There's also Dr. Tuttle, who is this completely unhinged quack psychiatrist who prescribes all the medication to the narrator, and she is hilarious. Every time the two of them meet, she says about a dozen completely insane things, and I wish I was keeping track so I could relay some of them here, but she made me laugh every single time she was around. She's big into energies and mystical recalibrations and adjusting lugubriations with copper rings and things like that. She's always wearing a foam neck brace from a taxi accident. She forgets and subsequently has to be reminded that the narrator's parents are dead every single time the two of them interact. She never picks up on the fact that the narrator is obviously lying and completely fabricating all sorts of contradictory symptoms for the sole purpose of acquiring drugs. She's just such a great, chaotic and strange foil to the narrator's blank, dispassionate aura. And their scenes together were awesome. Some of my favorites in the whole book. Lastly, and most importantly, there's Riva. She's the character who the narrator interacts with the most throughout the story, and they have a pretty peculiar interesting relationship. On one hand, they are ostensibly longtime best friends, but their entire relationship seems to be built on this weird foundation of jealousy and resentment, and it often feels like the two of them dislike each other more than they like each other. Riva is described as very superficial, vain, insecure, outwardly envious of the narrator's beauty and wealth, and in response, the narrator treats her with open disdain and annoyance and is often very rude to her. Like, for instance, even when Riva is confiding in her about the death of her mother, the narrator cannot even muster up the energy to pretend to care. But in spite of all that, they have a sort of yin-yang dynamic that is interesting to witness, I would say. Riva is desperate for approval from others, and the narrator is desperate for isolation from others. Riva is relentlessly engaged with the world, and the narrator is trying to escape the world by sleeping. In a lot of ways, they're opposites, but they share a kind of underlying pain and struggle for meaning in the world, and I guess that's what bonds them. Riva is loyal to the narrator despite such constant callous treatment, and the narrator seems to appreciate that in some subtle way. She even shows Riva occasional tenderness in her off-page blackout moments, like buying her flowers and writing her nice notes, even if those acts go unremembered by the narrator. And that's pretty much that. The narrator takes tons of pills, sleeps or is blacked out most of the time. He's kind of a dick, but in a funny, jaded sort of way. And then at the very end, the book pulls a remember me because suddenly it's 9/11 and Riva dies in 9/11. This didn't catch me completely off guard. I thought there were some subtle hints throughout the book, not to mention the time period and the setting in which the whole thing takes place, but the ending still feels a little inscrutable to me. The narrator wakes up from her 4-month blackout. She does seem to feel genuinely renewed and refreshed, and then shortly after, she watches Riva jump out of a window of the World Trade Center. The book ends with the line, "There she is, a human being, diving into the unknown, and she is wide awake." No matter how I try to interpret that, the narrator never comes out looking like a super great person, aside from the fact that she's finally regarding Riva with respect in her dying moments, as opposed to the whole time they were alive together. It also just makes her whole experiment feel kind of hollow and out of touch. Like the narrator's hyper-privileged ambient metamorphosis doesn't feel as profound when compared to such a horrific tragedy. I don't know, it's a bit difficult to interpret the ending. I don't hate it though. It's bizarre, but kind of striking, kind of like evocative to me. I don't think you're supposed to walk away from this book thinking the narrator is some beacon of change or integrity or anything. She was always kind of an asshole, and her journey felt more about personal escape rather than any sort of like genuine transformation or growth. There's really no neat or uplifting conclusion to that. So by the end, the book just leaves you with this lingering feeling of unease, kind of. There's all sorts of weird, unhealthy people, and they're all searching for meaning in their own weird, unhealthy ways. And I think that's why this book works. The characters are all kind of repulsive. They are doing and saying these absurd things, feeling absurd ways, but it's impossible to look away from them. I am feeling I would give this book like a very strong, very solid 8.